Hi gang, the first war for Armageddon is a little known conflict within the Imperium of Man. The second and third wars against the Orcs of Garzikal Thraka are widely hailed as Imperial victories, but the first war was covered up in the most brutal way possible, and the actions taken to prevent knowledge from getting out caused a year-long civil war between the Inquisition, the Grey Knights, and the enraged Space Wolves of Logan Grimnar. I am frequently reminded that this is a YouTube channel, and so I should probably say, like and subscribe. Armageddon is an unlucky planet in the Imperium, a massive industrialized hive world that has been invaded multiple times in its history, in particular in three colossal wars known as the First, Second, and Third War for Armageddon, or at least known to us that way. The Second and Third Wars, against the Orcs of Garzikal Thraka, are widely known in-world and lauded as great victories where the old man Commissar Yarrick defended the planet from a colossal Orc invasion, but in-world, they would be known as the First and Second Wars. The real First War for Armageddon was against a much more insidious foe, the forces of Chaos, and the fallout from it was so contentious that it caused a major schism in the Imperium of Man between the forces of the Inquisition and their Ordo Militant, the Grey Knights, whose desire was to brutally purge any who might have witnessed it, and the planet's defenders, the Space Wolves, who refused to let the Inquisition execute those they had so recently fought alongside. Matters built to such a point that Logan Grimnar killed a Grand Master of the Grey Knights, and Fenris was threatened with exterminatus in return, and relationships between the factions, almost the only ones left who remember it, have been strained ever since. For millennia, Armageddon has been a vital linchpin for the Imperial military machine. Armageddon is a world of manufacturing and industry, much of it geared towards the production of weapons, armoured vehicles, and munitions for the Imperial Guard, so much so that the planet is the industrial hub for not only its own Armageddon sector, but for the entire region. Few other Imperial worlds can compete with it in terms of sheer magnitude of goods produced. Millennia of such industry have turned its two primary land masses into a toxic wasteland. Like many hive worlds, the land between the hives has been ravaged by industrial pollution and overmining, and much of the surface is little more than barren ash wastes, only broken by a line of equatorial jungle that separates the primary continent into two halves, Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus. Life in the hive cities is hard. The majority of the population barely subsist in the forges and factories, ruled over by noble houses and defended by the famed Steel Legion, Armageddon's mechanized military, and civil strife within the hives is relatively common. This unrest is generally kept in check by brutal enforcement from the hive's rulers, but by the middle of the 41st millennium, the levels of disruption and unrest were an all-time high, fueled by Armageddon's impending invasion. Despite lying a mere 9,000 light-years southeast of Cadia and thus of the Eye of Terror, Armageddon had been lucky enough to have avoided overt chaos invasion for millennia, but that was all to change in the early 400s M41. The Bellum Chaotica, penned in the century following the war, states that in 499 M41, the Daemon Primarch of the World Eaters, Angron, raised a mighty horde of mutants, demons, and renegades, and embarked on an invasion of the Imperium. All other sources, of course, state that it's 444 M41, over 50 years earlier, but we can probably blame that on the vagaries of the warp, right? In either case, Angron, seeking to reunite his forces after a long period of conflict, assembled a massive horde of followers, thousands of Khorne berserkers and millions of cultists and renegades in a fleet centered around a truly massive ship, the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars, found drifting in the warp. At the time, warp storm activity had been steadily increasing across the Armageddon sector, and it was this increased turbulence that drew in Angron's horde. The Devourer of Stars was deposited on the furthest reaches of the Armageddon system, the augurs and listening posts of the subsector blaring with alarms as they detected the gargantuan ship and its attendant fleet of Chaos vessels. Ships were scrambled from the St. John's dock facility in an attempt to destroy the slow-moving Hulk in the void, but the ship was too large. charge, and thousands died to its weapon batteries, but they did manage to buy the planet some time. The system's naval fleet managed to blast part of the Hulk free. One of the vast starships that made up the Hulk's drive core was separated from the main body of the craft over Pellucidar, which slowed its progress. The defenders of Armageddon would have at least a month to prepare, which was useful because while they'd sent out the usual requests for aid, the raging warp storms would make reinforcement quite difficult. That drive section, once it was separated, eventually broke up in the atmosphere of Pellucidar, seeding the environment with toxic engine residue and eventually poisoning the planet's entire population. Anyway, the defenders of Armageddon had time, but they had reckoned without the insidious influence of chaos. The civil unrest and the uprisings, so common to Armageddon's habs and factory complexes, rose up to never-before-seen levels. And though the Steel Legion and the Hive Enforcers tried to maintain control, the spread of the taint was only realised when almost half the planetary defence force turned out to have been infiltrated by Khornate cults. As the Hulk drew closer, civil war broke out in many of the hives. On Armageddon Secundus, the reaction was swift and brutal. The Imperial Guard leadership quickly ascertained which units could be relied upon and which couldn't, and organised a swift retribution. Loyal Steel Legion units surrounding and eliminating the traitors before taking up their posts on the defence lines. But on Armageddon Prime, the betrayal was harder to contain. Armageddon Prime's hives were fewer in number and spread much further apart, and command there was much slower to react. As the Devourer of Stars finally bullied its way into orbit, the hives of Prime were torn apart by fighting, as traitor and loyal defence forces fought in the trenches they should have been defending. Taking advantage of the chaos, Angron's forces landed on Armageddon Prime first, waves of demons quickly overrunning the continent and rampaging through the hive cities. Angron's frenzied warriors carved their way across the continent with horrifying ease, stopping only to raise great monuments to the glory of the Blood God. Traitor Titans dueled the few remaining Loyalist Legion elements as Angron and his Cruor Praetoria, his bodyguard of 12 esteemed bloodthirsters, rampaged through the hives. The rivers of Armageddon Prime were choked with bones and blood. Great abattoirs were built to offer the population up for slaughter, and the remaining loyal defenders were forced to fall back, making for the jungles and Armageddon Secundus beyond. They left behind a land ruled by the demonic and the insane. It was said that the piles of corpses reached as high as the hive spires themselves. But the warp is an unreliable source of power, and as Angron's forces pursued the survivors, and the acts of slaughter empowered the demons, the warp storms themselves started to wane. Deprived of a constant source of warp energy, much of Angron's force would find it difficult to maintain its link to the mortal realm long term, and so Angron ordered the construction of a huge monolith and temple through which his forces could draw a constant source of warp power. The Khornate cultists and hive survivors were whipped into work gangs to build this huge construction, set up on the edges of the equatorial jungle, and thousands more were sacrificed to consecrate it. But the time he spent doing this had delayed Angron's advance for several weeks, and the defenders didn't wait. With the warp storms temporarily waning, one force of Imperial reinforcements were able to make it through. The Space Wolves chapter had answered the call for aid, making the journey from their relatively nearby homeworld of Fenris under the command of their then recently appointed new chapter master, Logan Grimnar, at the time a mere 200 years old. When the Chaos Forces resumed their attack, breaking through the jungles and heading south, they were to find a well-ordered and organised Imperial defence. The Steel Legion hardened by the presence of the Space Wolves and by Grimnar's fiery speeches. The main bulk of the Khornate horde reacted exactly as he'd predicted, drawn towards the largest concentration of Imperial defenders who had fortified the far banks of the river Charon just past the edge of the jungles. The horde of mutants, cultists and berserkers were drawn on, breaking in waves against the Imperial defence lines and filling the river with bodies, and the Space Wolves did everything they could to lure the Khornate forces out. Grimnar himself led an armoured assault straight across the mile-wide river, drawing forces of Khorn berserkers out of the jungles and taking a heavy toll before falling back in good order. When they'd crossed the river again, back to the safety of the Imperial defence lines, Grimnar's trap was sprung and the full weight might of the Steel Legion's armour was deployed, the river coming alive with explosions as the tanks of the Imperial Guard roared their displeasure, and a line of 100 Grey Hunters, supported by thousands of Steel Legionnaires, opened fire. But while the plan at the River Charon had succeeded, not all of the Khornate forces were so easily led. While the cultist horde battered themselves against the river, to the west, Angron and his Cruor Praetoria led an assault on Hell's Reach and Infernus hives, the Bloodthirsters and their demonic hordes butchering their way through the defence lines. Nothing could stop their rampage, but, unknown to the defenders for good reason, Grimnar had another card to play. Shortly after his arrival on Armageddon, Logan Grimnar had sent out his own requests for aid. As the chapter master of the Space Wolves, he was aware of certain truths of the Imperium few others were meant to be aware of, and knowing the danger posed by Angron and his demonic horde, he dispatched a number of Fenrisian vessels on an urgent mission to bring word to the Grey Knights on Titan and to summon them to fight alongside him. This was quite a difficult task. The Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, were intended to be a closely guarded secret. Even Grimnar wasn't meant to know about them, and the warp storms that surrounded Armageddon had increased in ferocity again with the building of the Khornate monuments. Many of the Space Wolves' vessels were lost to the warp or barely functioning once they breached the storms, but two managed to get through. One vessel, the Frostborn, was discovered becalmed in the void by the Fenrisian Inquisitor Annika Jarlsdotter and her accompanying Grey Knight squad, its lone surviving Space Wolf bringing news of the doom of Armageddon. And a second one just about made it back to Titan, eventually crashing into its surface. With their forces scattered across the galaxy and the invasion ongoing, only those Grey Knights currently on Titan or easily contactable could be spared to respond, and a small fleet containing 100 knights under the command of Brother Captain Aurelian had already deployed into Armageddon's orbit, where they were met by Grimnar. Grimnar had overall command of the planet and didn't want to reveal his hand yet, and furthermore, he had no love for the Inquisition or their servants, who would surely condemn to death any who witnessed the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights were to wait for his signal so they could be deployed directly into the fight against the Daemon Primarch. That way, not only would the forces of Chaos be caught unawares, but relatively few of the loyal citizens of Armageddon would witness that action. And in theory, that's exactly what happened. As Grimnar redeployed his forces to meet Khornate advances near the River Styx, the Grey Knights teleported into battle against Angron and his bodyguard. The fighting was brutal. Scores of Grey Knights died to the red blades of the Bloodthirsters or were overrun by the lesser demons of the Horde, but eventually they were victorious. Brother Hyperion, one of those who'd originally discovered the Frostborn, managed to break the black blade of Angron, and Brother Captain Aurelian banished the Primarch in single combat, though he was killed doing so. With their leader gone, the invaders proved easy prey for the Space Wolves and for the Steel Legion, but while the war was over, the conflict didn't end there. In the aftermath of the First War, the Inquisition, led by Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisneros and the Grand Master of the 8th Brotherhood of Grey Knights, Joros, began a systematic purge of the planet. While few had witnessed the Grey Knights in action, many had witnessed the demonic hordes, and so the entire planet was condemned. On the surface, a thorough program of mind wipe and execution began. Those Imperial Guardsmen and Hive defenders who had taken part in the war sentenced to death, and those citizens who'd made it through unscathed but still heard of the invasion were unknowingly sterilised in forced labour camps to the south. With the hives empty of all but the most wealthy and influential citizens, a new labour force was to be shipped in from off-world, while the original population of Armageddon died in slavery. Of course, Logan Grimnar vehemently abhorred these practices, considering it an example of the Imperium having betrayed its citizens, who deserved the glory of victory. He raged at the cowards of the Inquisition, and matters came to a head as the Inquisition attempted to fire on the troop transports of the Imperial Guard, which had arrived in system to carry the Steel Legion off to its next assignment. Grimnar wouldn't let the callous expediency of the Inquisition condemn to death the warriors his chapter had only just fought alongside. As Kisneros gave the order for the Grey Knights craft to open fire, Grimnar's vessels interposed themselves, refraining from returning fire, but successfully escorting many of the troop ships to their translation points. And as the first troop ships made their jumps into the warp, the rest of the Space Wolves fleet arrived, inbound from Fenris, and the Grey Knights and Inquisitorial cruisers were forced to stand down. The conflict, again, didn't end there, though. What followed this action was known as the Months of Shame, as a strange, cold war began between the Grey Knights and the Inquisition and the Space Wolves chapter. Inquisitor Lord Kisneros ordered containment, and fast Grey Knight strike cruisers followed the trail of the troopships, attempting to silence them before word of Armageddon spread. Spaceports and military stations that made contact with the troopships or redistributed those troops were wiped from the void by lone Grey Knights cruisers. Sometimes troopships were discovered en route, but frequently they were protected by Space Wolves vessels, who once again interposed themselves or harried the attackers, refusing to return fire but allowing the troopships to get away unharmed. This went on for months, despite repeated calls from the Inquisition for the Space Wolves to stand down, and the longer it went on, the harder it became for the Grey Knights to contain, as the regiments aboard split up to be assigned to new war zones. Eventually, after months of this and untold destruction, Kisneros and Joros managed to arrange a parley in neutral space. But when the 5 ships of the Space Wolves arrived, Grandmaster Joros gave the order to open fire, crippling some of the ships in an attempt to take Grimnar hostage. Grimnar was eventually persuaded to teleport aboard the Grey Knight's flagship for his inevitable surrender, but his intention was anything but. Arriving battle-ready, the Great Wolf and his bodyguard slew Grandmaster Joros for his betrayal, and his bodyguard ruthlessly gunned down the Grey Knight's Justicars, disrupting their squad's abilities to coordinate their psychic powers in response. With that statement made, he teleported back to his flagship and made good his escape. For months longer, the conflict continued, though now the Space Wolves attacked wherever they could. Grey Knights and Inquisitorial ships in pursuit of the scattered warriors of Armageddon were actively hunted down by Space Wolves vessels, with no mercy shown to any of the personnel on board. And while the Grey Knights continued in their containment attempts, there was growing discontent within the Inquisition. Many other Inquisitors were growing increasingly unhappy with Kisneros's continued purge and uncomfortable at prosecuting such actions against the first founding chapter like the Space Wolves. And that wasn't helped when the Lord Inquisitor attempted to put an end to this rebellion by enacting the threat he'd originally made back in orbit of Armageddon and mustering for an invasion of Fenris. The combined Grey Knights fleet, assisted by Inquisitorial vessels and the ever-loyal Red Hunters chapter, translated in system and made immediate calls for the Great Wolf to meet them. Kisneros still wanted to avoid all-out war. His intention was to threaten the destruction of Fenris by Exterminatus, to force Grimnar to stand down, and then have them agree to a penitent crusade or something to show their contrition. But of course, Grimnar was already one step ahead. While the fleet surrounded the planet easily and were granted their request for parley on a landing platform near the summit of the Space Wolves Fortress Monastery, it wasn't Grimnar who strode out to meet them, but the ancient dreadnought Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a warrior who'd fought alongside Liman Russ himself, woken from his slumber in the depths of the Fang. The presence of such a venerated hero of the Imperium gave the Inquisitorial delegation pause, and from their negotiation, it was clear that the Space Wolves would never give in to the Inquisition's demands, but as Bjorn dismissed their ultimatums, it also became clear that this was a delaying action. In orbit, again, the entire Space Wolves fleet arrived, and as the delegation returned to their vessels, war broke out in the void above the planet. Kisneros once again attempted to contain the situation, but the void shields of the Coral's Hope, his flagship, were quickly brought down, and Grimnar and his Terminator elite teleported to the bridge, slaying the Grey Knights and Inquisitorial stormtroopers stationed there before Grimnar cut down Kisneros himself. And with that, the conflict was tentatively ended. Grimnar was then persuaded to stand his forces down by Bjorn, the death of Kisneros having settled the matter, and in truth, the other Inquisitors were more than ready to put the whole affair behind them. While no official war had happened, and therefore no official truce was made, the two sides separated and just moved on to other matters, almost a year having passed since the first war for Armageddon. The months of shame were finally over, but they damaged relations between those two sides for centuries after. Even now, Grimnar has an abiding hatred for the Inquisition and its servants, and for the dishonor they forced upon his chapter, and the Space Wolves are considered to be dangerously untrustworthy by some in the Inquisition, a fissure driven between two imperial agencies that would likely never heal again. And of course, Armageddon wasn't spared either. Despite its repopulation, 2 more colossal wars would follow in the latter years of the 41st millennium as War Garzacle invaded the planet. And then, in the early years of the era Indomitus, the Grey Knights and Space Wolves would find themselves fighting once again on the surface, as Angron returned once more. And since that's the most recent attempt, as I write this, I'll skip to the tentatively named 4th Armageddon War next, before eventually coming back to our green pals. Sequels for the sequel god, lore for the lore throne. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more videos about the lore of 40k, especially all the weird campaigns and battles, there should be a video popping up there to the right. Also, there's merch, there's a Patreon, there's a YouTube membership scheme, and you get loads of lovely little perks for joining any of them. See ya!